Paula Wellsa. Evo, prije nego što Paul počne sa predavanjem, samo nekoliko osnovnih biografskih podataka. Umirovljeni bojnik Paul Wells ukratko će nam na engleskom jeziku govoriti o uzrocima i problemima u Sjevernoj Irskoj 1969. godine, te razvoju Irske republikanske vojske u učinkovitu organizaciju. Također, usredotočiti će se na vlastita iskustva, osnovne taktike i organizaciju unutar svoje regimente, koja je bila raspoređena u mjestu Ballymurphy u zapadnom Belfastu, te kasnije 1972. u četvrti The Falls, također u Belfastu. I nekoliko samo riječi o njegovoj biografiji. Paul Wells pridružio se britanskoj vojsci kao časnik kadet u listopadu 1969. s 19 godina. U svibnju 1970. primljen je u padobransku postrojbu, ali ozljeda na jurišnom tečaju dovela ga je do toga da nije završio prethodnu padobransku obuku. U listopadu 70. pridružio se drugom bataljunu do Royal Anglian postrojbe u Colchesteru, a sljedećeg se dana našao u Ballymurphyu, zapadni Belfast. Služio kao zapovjednik voda u bataljunu na 2 ture u Belfastu. Druga tura 72. bila je u četvrti The Lower Falls. U svojoj raznolikoj vojnoj karijeri služio je u Njemačkoj, u gradu Münsteru i također u zapadnom Berlinu. U Sjevernu Irsku vratio se 1980. godine kao stožerni časnik na godinu dana sa sjedištem u mjestu Portadown. Bio je odgovoran za cijelo pogranično područje s Republikom Irskom. Nakon prelaska u The Royal Army Education Corps 82. kasnije će podnijeti ostavku na svoju dužnost u činu bojnika britanske vojske i to je bilo 1987. godine. Po završetku vojne karijere posvetio se civilnoj karijeri i radio je u engleskim školama. Evo, toliko o njegovoj biografiji. Prije nego što samo predavanje počne, 2 informacije. Paul je priredio ovdje nekoliko časopisa koje su bili objavljeni na području Sjeverne Irske, odnose se na događanja aktivnostima koje je Ira provodila u Sjevernoj Irskoj. Tu je prilično su okrutne fotografije unutra, pa onda nećemo sada slati da svi gledaju, nego ko zaista želi vidjeti može ih pogledati na stolu. I ovdje je također jedan mali isječak iz novina koji se odnosi također na zbivanja na području Sjeverne Irske gdje se nalazi njegova regimenta. Ali evo, detalje toga moći ćete vidjeti na samome stolu. Dakako, pitanja ćemo ostaviti za kraj. Evo, ja predlažem da počnemo. Vrijeme nam je spremno. Evo, nakon 17 godina Paul Wells po prvi puta će se javno obratiti jer je 2007. godine otišao u mirovinu dok je radio u školi. Evo ga, toliko od mene. Paul, it's your turn now. You can start.
I had prepared something in Hrvatski for you, but as the numbers here are small, I will still practice it. Dobro večer, dame I gospodo. Hvala vam na dolasku. That's all you're going to get in Hrvatski tonight. Before I get into Ballymurphy and the Lower Falls, I think I need to cover some history, and I will try and be as brief as possible. You have to remember that Ireland was the first colony of the great British Empire, and it all began in 1177 when Henry II took an army, a small army, over to Ireland and basically took it over. And that's where the troubles between the English and the Irish began and have continued and are still continuing today. What to do with the Irish? Because they wanted their independence they wanted their freedom. They never did like the English. And as a result, we had rebellions. And the Tudors had their problems, so they decided what a good idea it would be to transplant good Protestants from the rest of Britain into Ireland. So we then had the plantation of a friendly, English-speaking Protestant population put into Ireland. And this is where it all went wrong. Because by 1720, there was a majority of Protestants in what we now know as the 6 counties or Ulster. So let me move on. This is a shot of me in Divis in 1972. Notice I'm carrying a self-loading rifle. More about that later. This was the situation in 1861, and then the situation in 1991 in terms of population. Where you've got pink and purple, if I just use this little button, this part, Antrim down, over 80% Protestant population. This part in County Londonderry, and then Tyrone and Fermanagh, the population was more mixed, about half and half. So that is where we had the concentration in Ireland of the Protestants. Now, one of the problems, of course, is that this British majority, so to speak, in Northern Ireland were quite happy because they were loyal unionists. That's what they were there for. They were there to support the Crown. And despite various rebellions that were put down very badly by various campaigns, of which the worst was Cromwell and his New Model Army in 1652. What he did basically was march through Ireland, putting down any dissent, and at the town of Drogheda, which is in the Republic, he butchered, or his army butchered, 2,500 soldiers and inhabitants and behaved very badly. And on my first tour in Ballymurphy in 1970, a woman went, "You're just bad as Cromwell." So the Irish still remember Cromwell from 320 odd years earlier, and they still remember in their folklore how bad the English were to them. So we come through to the beginning of the 20th century, where after an awful lot of pro-independence chatter going on, and we had the English-Irish treaty that followed basically the insurrection that was begun in the Easter Rising in 1916. And it was decided that, yes, we will get out of Ireland, but there's a small problem. What about the 1 million or so Protestants to the north? Remember, they had just all come back from the Great War. So there was a large population of fit males who had received military training, and they formed themselves in Northern Ireland into the Ulster Volunteer Force and began parading with weapons, and the government had a problem. They were saying, no way are we going to be part of an Irish state. We are unionists, we want to belong to the UK. So it was decided to cut up the country. If you're a Republican, you call the Republic of Ireland the 26 counties, and you call Ulster or Northern Ireland the 6 counties. And that immediately shows that you are effectively a Republican. And to some extent, I'm a Republican, because I really find it strange that we have never yet given up our very first colony, despite the empire letting all its other countries go. So when I was there in 1970, the population in Ulster, in Northern Ireland, was about 1.5 million. The population in the Republic was 4.9 million. That was still less than the 8.9 million that were there in 1841. And it shows you the problems that the Irish potato famine and the Great Hunger caused in Ireland, for which, of course, the English were blamed. And even now, the population of the whole of Ireland has not reached those levels yet. So let me now move on a little bit then to the civil rights marches that began in the late 60s. If you were a Protestant in Northern Ireland, you spoke in a slightly different way to a Catholic person living in Ireland. So you were immediately labelled by the way you spoke, by your name, which was a Catholic name, or your address, and as a result, we had a situation where there was desperate discrimination against the Catholic population. Schooling was separate, intermarriages didn't happen, so these two communities had been coexisting in the major towns, in Londonderry and in Belfast, and with this rising up of the civil rights and wanting fair representation, fair housing, the civil rights movement gathered enormous support from, of course, the Catholic or Republican community. And sadly, it led to violence. And here, this picture shows you the Royal Ulster Constabulary in 1969 dealing with a riot in Londonderry. They also had a reserve called the B Specials. And these people were 99% Protestant. So they had no sympathy at all for the civil rights marches and actually discriminated in terms of off-duty members of the B Specials stoning and causing problems to the civil rights movement. This developing civil disorder led to this in 1969. This is a platoon from the 3rd Battalion of the Queen's Regiment, who were at that time a garrison battalion in Ballykinler in County Down. And they were deployed onto the streets of Belfast because tribalism had set in, where communities were burning each other out of their houses and their homes, and there was disorder and chaos that the police could not control. You'll notice, if you look carefully, that soldiers are fixed bayonets on the ends of their rifles. They are in the traditional colonial anti-riot mode. And I can remember being trained like this when I was an officer cadet. But one of the things we did is we opened fire on rioters, and we were taught to shoot a dangerous rioter, and that would dispel the riot. But of course, this is part of the United Kingdom. You can't do that. So, in a sense, the problem could not be solved, strictly speaking, by the army. It stopped problems happening, it brought an uneasy peace, and the soldiers were welcomed, funnily enough, by both communities, both the Protestant community and the Catholic community. If I now look at this map, where you see green in, I can't see whether you are, this area here, this is West Belfast, from the falls there all the way down to Andersonstown down here. And you notice that these boundary areas were where most of the problems were occurring. If we come to Ballymurphy, you see that Ballymurphy, sitting there, is right on the corner of a Protestant area. And where the army was based in Ballymurphy was in fact a Protestant primary school, the Vere Foster School, and a Presbyterian hall called the Henry Taggart Memorial Hall. And that's where we were based. Now, if I move on from there, this is a view into Ballymurphy Estate, and that is a platoon dealing with a gathering riot. Notice the back row are armed with rifles, but everyone else are carrying shields and batons. Now, the problem you had with rioting is that to stop rioting, you need to make arrests. But how do you close the distance between you and the rioters? They came up with a rubber bullet, which was pretty useless, quite frankly. They came up with a baton round later on that was equally useless. The way to get it was to actually get into the crowd and make arrests. But how do you do that when you're equipped like these soldiers are with heavy boots, a flak jacket, your rifle or your baton and your shield, your helmet that doesn't fit very nicely on your head, and you go rushing towards these young men who are throwing stones at you? You're not going to catch them. So that sort of tactic of just standing there and being stoned was not a very clever one. When I joined my battalion in Colchester in 1970, I arrived in Colchester to find that, oh, Paul, you're with B Company, here's your company commander, and you're off on the advance party to Belfast tomorrow morning. I hadn't met my soldiers, I hadn't met my platoon sergeant, I didn't have any kit, I hadn't done any training that they had done specific to Ireland, and I found myself on the advance party. And we took over from a gunner regiment called 16 Light Air Defence Regiment. Here's our organisation of a standard rifle company. You'll see that we have a company headquarters and 3 rifle platoons, and that each rifle platoon consists of 3 sections. So we have a platoon headquarters, a second lieutenant or a lieutenant, a sergeant, a signaller, a runner, and a sniper, if we were lucky. The rifle section was normally a corporal in command with 7 riflemen. So we only had about 29 soldiers to 30, depending on what we were doing. The problem of the army taking over a base is that you've got to guard that base. So one platoon immediately is guarding the base because each section will be guarding the base for 8 hours. So in 24 hours you need 3 sections. So there's one platoon out of the running for any operation. It's guarding your base. You've then got another platoon on standby. The third platoon will be patrolling. So what we had was a situation where we had a 3-day rota: patrol, guard, on standby. And the standby platoon would be used for searches, for bolstering any operation that was going on, or doing little jobs like stopping cars and doing vehicle checkpoints, this sort of thing. So the organisation was limited in terms of troops actually on the ground. This is a yellow card which was given to me and every soldier in the battalion, and every British soldier who was deployed to Northern Ireland got this yellow card. And it reminded us that we must use minimum force and that we should only open fire at the last resort. And we should actually say, "Stop, army, or I fire," which was fine in Ballymurphy in 1970. We had a a magazine of 20 rounds connected to a rifle. You weren't allowed to have a round, as we would say, up the spout or in the breech. You had to cock your weapon to return fire. And you were liable to prosecution if you did not follow the instructions to the letter in this yellow card. More about that later. Anyway, we deployed to Ballymurphy, and we found these in the parking lot. They're called pigs, 1-ton Humber. And you'll notice that the two soldiers at the front have greener guns or rubber bullet guns. And this was our standard section vehicle for the standby platoon, or was used on patrols. Let me talk about my very first riot. Riots are fun. For soldiers, riots are fun. The adrenaline is high. Stones, bottles, petrol bombs, pretty harmless stuff. Even acid that they filled some milk bottles with sulfuric acid from batteries. This was fun because we're doing something. Because for those of you who've been soldiers, you will know that a lot of soldiering is 95% waiting and being bored, with 5% action. The rest of the time, it is boring. And this is what people fail to appreciate. So when we had riots in Ballymurphy, we actually enjoyed them. It was fun. I hate to say it, but it was. But things were slightly different by accident. The gunners who we took over from used to stand in straight lines and be stoned. Not a good idea. So anyway, we had our first riot. Welcome to Ballymurphy, the Royal Anglian Regiment. The locals will put on a party for you. And they did, opposite the Henry Taggart. And they came out one evening en masse. It started with little children and then bigger children and then the adults, till we had 400 or 500 people opposite the Henry Taggart and the Springfield Road, throwing stones at our front entrance. At that stage, my company commander said, right, standby platoon, which happened to be me and my boys, off you go and deal with that. So, got my guys all in the vehicles and off we went. My platoon sergeant was behind, in the vehicle behind, and I took a quick left turn off the Springfield Road to bring me round to where the rioting was. The only problem was my platoon sergeant didn't know the area so well because he'd only been there 2 or 3 days at that stage. So I arrived on Diversmore Park, got my boys out the back, looked around for my other 2 vehicles. Where's the rest of my platoon? I've got 400 people throwing stones and being horrible. And one of my soldiers got hit on the knee and I went, oh dear, this is not good. Where on earth is my platoon sergeant and the rest of my platoon? Right, what do I do? I thought, right, sod it. Excuse me, sorry. Let's just drive the vehicle straight at them and we'll charge them. And what happens is that people don't like being charged with soldiers carrying batons and with a big 1-ton vehicle like you see there. They don't like that coming towards them, so they ran. And I went, oh, this is good. What do we do, though, when they realize it's just me still? And then this wonderful sound of 2 vehicles grinding their way round the back. And of course, at this stage, the crowd were looking over their shoulder, behind them, thinking, what's going on? This hasn't been done before. We normally just spend 2 hours throwing stones at the British soldiers. What are they doing coming round behind? So anyway, he bundled round the back. They all scattered, end of riot. So we went back to the Henry Taggart and went, well, that was quick. So in a sense, we just didn't put up with rioting. I refused, and I think my company commander took the attitude as we will not stand there and be stoned by children, then adults, or petrol bombed. We will go in and try and make arrests or just try and scare them away, which is what we did. Quick look at the school here. This is the BELFASTU school where we had a sanger on the roof, one of our sentry posts. That is a view over there to what I call the riot playground. Whenever we had riots or stoning, that's where it came from, there. We still had Land Rovers, soft-top Land Rovers with meshes on the windows. That's a front gate's sanger with a sentry in, and that is the back gate, and you'll see the flats behind, and we had the school. So we had 2 platoons in the school and 1 platoon in the the Henry Taggart Hall. Now this picture, you can't see it clearly, but let me see if I can, there we go. You might just make the outlines of a vehicle there. That is an MOD fire engine. You might ask yourself, what are we doing with the fire engine there? Well, we started having discos for the boys because it wasn't all riots, it wasn't all aggro. The people, when we first went there, were happy to see us, believe it or not. My boys were getting cups of tea and biscuits from little old ladies in their houses. They were very nice, until, of course, the IRA started to move around the area saying, we won't have fraternization, and it stopped. But we still had time to rest and relax, so once a week we had a disco. Now, to start with, the girls from Ballymurphy would come into the disco because, although I didn't think my soldiers were that particularly sophisticated, in terms of the local boys, our soldiers were travelled, experienced, handsome in uniform. The girls came until they were warned off. And what then happened was we got girls in from the Protestant areas to come and party with the boys, which they did. But when that happened, we then had a riot develop. We would have the disco, and then outside we'd get a crowd of maybe 50 to 100 women singing Republican songs, and then the stones would start and the riot would start. So we had a good idea. Let's get a fire engine, because it can just throw water over the Springfield Road, and we'll spray the Glenalina Girls Choir, as we called them. We'll spray them with water, and then they'll go home. So we brought this fire engine down by our front gate. Now this is right on the front of the Springfield Road. It's 20 meters from the area I showed you earlier, where the rioting and that platoon was standing. This should reach across the road and further down, and it will wet the crowd. So we practiced behind a screen. We put a screen up, and we practiced. And there was the fireman with the appliance telling my boys he's got to hold the hose and the nozzle, and you need 2 guys on it because it'll start moving around because of the pressure. So, right, okay, we'll have a dry practice so that the locals don't realize what we're up to. And then the disco. Then the girls' choir turned up and the stones started coming across. Right, stand by with the hose. Ready, steady, go. This pathetic trickle of water that came out of the hose pipe didn't even get halfway across the road. The women just stood there and laughed. We stood there and laughed. And we turned the damn thing off and sent it back to wherever it came from the following day. We were acutely embarrassed. But that was the story of the fire engine. Here are typical scenes. I'm sorry about the quality of the pictures. This is a little gathering that begins in the afternoon. Mainly school children. What should we do after school? Let's go and throw stones at the soldiers, because we're there across the road. You can see our front gate there. What we would do is send a section down to chase them away. That's what that is, just chasing them away. And the kids loved it. But in more serious riots, we had burnt out vehicles. So these are engineer trucks with cars and debris and other things on the back. Here's a better picture of some of that debris. We had our own scrapyard. You can see the vehicles we cleared off the road when they hijacked them and set them on fire and were misbehaving. We could have made a lot of money actually selling scrap iron, but there we are. This is a view, the left-hand shot. This is a view of the riot area. The Glenlena Girls Choir would stand on the bank there. This is the Henry Tackett Memorial Hall, and there's the school there. A word about the school: we didn't have any showers or baths. And of course, after a couple of weeks, despite our laundry being looked after and even with washing from sinks, these are little children's sinks, by the way, so you had to bend down like this. We started to get smelly, so we actually were sent off to a mobile bath unit. If you've ever watched Band of Brothers, the series by HBO, you will see that they are sent into a mobile bath unit at one stage. Well, we actually had that. That was from the Second World War, a mobile bath unit. Oh, it was good. It was hot water, it was clean, it felt good, but there we go. As far as the funny thing about being in a school for primary school children and infants, the cubicles were so high, so when you went to use the toilet, if there was anybody else in the sort of the row of 6 toilets, you could talk over the top because our heads were and shoulders were sticking above the cubicles. So it was quite funny, but anyway, there were no facilities there other than the school kitchen. This is a view of the Henry Taggett Hall on the left. It's been demolished. There's a nice barbed wire shot showing you the school behind. Let me come to this little story. There's the typical Belfast brat throwing stones. Now, when you think about it, if you're unemployed and you're living a miserable life on a miserable housing estate in West Belfast and it's wet an awful lot of the time, how much fun is it to go and throw stones and bricks and bottles at the soldiers? Great fun. But anyway, things got a little bit serious. The powers that be in the army decided that they wanted to search 11 properties in Ballymurphy one morning and to wake everybody up at 6 o'clock and search 11 houses. So they had 11 search teams in Land Rovers stood by, who then whisked into the area and kicked down front doors and burst in on people in their houses because of information, intelligence. Nothing was found, but if you want to be foolish, go and stick your stick, your walking stick, into a hornet's nest. What will happen? The hornets will come out en masse. Well, that's what happened with 11 search teams in Ballymurphy. The estate rose up like a hornet's nest. There were hundreds of people. And 10 of the teams got out, but 1 team was trapped in a house. I was on standby platoon, 4 platoon were on standby that day. So I had to go down and rescue these people stuck in the house. When I arrived, there were 400 or 500 people gathered around. They weren't trying to break into the house because, of course, it's one of their own person's house and the people are inside, as well as the army search team, plus an RUC woman constable to search the women and girls. So, yeah, they wouldn't open the door to me when I went and knocked on the door. And the crowd then started throwing bottles and glass, and they'd hijacked a milk float, and this came, bottles galore came flying over. My company commander arrived in his Land Rover and then had to do a quick reverse because there was so much glass hitting his Land Rover. He had to pull away. They couldn't see what they were doing. There was so much glass still stuck in their vents. So anyway, I got the team into the back of this pig, this one here, and then I shut the back door and walked round to get in this side door here, and there was a bang from behind me and a bang that hit the side of the pig. And it wasn't till I got back that I realized how lucky I'd been, because I turned round and thought, that's a shot, someone's shooting at me. I didn't join the army to be shot at. I joined for the uniform, for travel and adventure, not to be shot at. So I reached for my pistol and thought, don't be silly. A man in a long black coat had turned round. The cordite from his one round that he had fired was hanging in the steamy air, and he was walking back into the crowd. So yellow card rules, I can't shoot. What do I say? Halt, army, I will fire? You know, no. So I thought, oh, how silly this is. Got in the vehicle and drove away. When I got back, of course, that's what we found on the front. And that was the first time we got shot at in Ballymurphy. And then things that day got seriously nasty. We had major rioting. They had to call in a company of one para from the other side of Belfast to come in and help us. But we did start making arrests, because what we had developed was an idea of all the fit physical training instructors would wear plimsolls, no flak jacket, no helmet, but just battens, in the back of a long wheelbase Land Rover, and would drive into the crowd and get out and hit people, mainly on the shoulder, on the collarbone, which then would put them on the ground going like that. At that stage, we with our pigs would come forward and pick up people who were groaning or moaning. We arrested that night somewhere between 40 and 50 rioters, which was amazing because they stopped rioting after that. And what was interesting is that the following day, they were dealt with by Belfast Magistrates Court. And we had to say, Soldier X, did you arrest this guy last night? Yes, because, okay, so right, you arrested those three and you arrested those three, and it was a little bit unjust, if I'm honest. But anyway, the magistrates were absolutely ruthless. Rioting, what have you got to say? What were you doing? I'm innocent, sir, said one lad who was about 16 or 17. I was out blackberrying, looking for Kupina, with my milk bottles in my pocket. Oh, right, said the magistrate. 6 months, bang, next case. They were all dealt with the following morning, all got 6 months in prison. That's how justice used to be like in the United Kingdom. No messing, and I was rather pleased about that. But it wasn't all riot and boredom and patrolling and nothing happening. We also had fun. This is me on the right opening my Christmas parcel from my parents. And this is Christmas Day celebration. The chap in the middle is, where are we? Hold on. That's John Hart, my company commander. That was Simon Hopkins, and this guy was Ray Hazan, who was our company second in command. He sadly in 1974 was blown up with the parcel bomb that was taken into the ops room when the battalion was in Londonderry. He was blinded, lost a lot of his right arm, and never saw his child. His wife was pregnant at the time. But he did an awful lot of work for St. Dunstan's, a blind charity. But anyway, we even went into town. I went into town in civvies. You can see that Simon Hopkins and Ray Hazan are in civilian clothes. They've been out that day. So it wasn't all aggro at all in Ballymurphy. Yes, we had our moments, but the rest of the time it was quite peaceful, just a normal estate. Let me move on. We left. We went back to Colchester. We then retrained to become a mechanized battalion in Germany. But what happened? Op Demetrius in August 1971, so this is about 7 months after we left. They introduced internment. This is arresting people and locking them away, and without trial. It was based on faulty intelligence. It was old information. So they put 300 odd people into what we called Long Kesh at the time. But we had the parachute regiment, one para, who shot 11 people in Ballymurphy over a period of 2 days. One of whom was a Catholic priest. You'll see him on the right there. He was our local parish priest. I think it was a big mistake. Internment was a disaster. Yes, some of the parachute regiment may have been shot at, but they were shooting out of control, I'm afraid to say. And I think what they did was a disgrace, because this is how you recruit people to the Provisional IRA, this sort of thing. Internment did it, this then added to it. This is a view of Long Kesh. It was like an old wartime army barracks. Think of a German-type prison camp from the Second World War, and that was Long Kesh. So what you did is you put the internees in long wooden huts together. So what did they do? Of course, they practiced how to be good terrorists, didn't they? So when they were released, we then had a further problem, because this was a training school for terrorism. So again, a silly mistake. Then we had Bloody Sunday, Londonderry, February, a civil rights march, 13 people shot. There may have been some shooting by the Provisional IRA, but it's quite clear from the various inquiries that have taken place that soldiers were reckless in their shooting and were shooting innocent civilians. Again, this is remembered and will be remembered for years, and was to me was a sad thing to happen, because we had further recruiting to the IRA following this. This is, I hate to say, my first battalion. This was the 1st Battalion, the Royal Anglian Regiment in Londonderry. You might notice the cap badge on their helmets. They were the resident battalion there. They're arresting somebody. You can see that they've arrested him in a riot situation because they're carrying riot shields and have got their helmets on. But notice that. Why are we kicking somebody who we've got under control? Again, further recruiting for the IRA. Not good. Here's me. While all of this mayhem was going on in Ireland, I was in Munster, being a platoon commander of a mech platoon with my armoured personnel carriers, AFE 432s, and life was good. A nice sunny day. I was embarrassed here. I won't go into why I was sitting there with a fence in front of me. All I will say is I was navigationally embarrassed, and that fence had to be driven over for me to get out of my embarrassment. But there we go. That's me on the top, by the way, suggesting that we just carry on driving. Anyway, let us return to Belfast, 1972, July. Let me just walk you around. This is the layout of the Divis flats. This map is older. I couldn't find a 1970s map. This is the city centre. This is the Lower Falls area. You'll see Albert Street there, and you'll see the cathedral church there. More about that in a moment. There's an aerial view of Divis Flats. That is Divis Tower, which is the only block still standing. The purpose of building Divis Flats was that it would remove the population in the slums in the Lower Falls and give them good, decent housing. There you see the cathedral church. This is all new around here. Albert Street Mill was there, but it's all been demolished, so this is the best aerial photograph I could get. There's a view. The left-hand photograph shows you how close we were to Divis Flats. Those are the flats there. Divis Tower in the background. But you can see you can move people from slums into nice new accommodation, but that doesn't stop them turning it back into a slum, sadly. Notice the stairwells that go up and give you access. So there's the ground floor flats, that's the middle flats, and those are the flats on the top. So there were 3 layers of housing. And these are the walkways outside people's front doors. So you'd go up a stairwell, then walk along the walkway. Yes, let's move on. We had an addition to our vehicles. We didn't have just pigs and 1-ton Humbers. We had Saracens. Notice the .303 Browning there. So we had to train gunners to use this because it was no longer at that time a standard infantry weapon. The Royal Army Armoured Corps had it, not us. If I can just pause for a moment here. Get my notes sorted out. We were based in Albert Street Mill. That's me in the ops room. I had to do every third night. I spent all night long in the ops room acting as a watchkeeper, while my platoon was on guard, guarding the mill. This is the view outside the mill. If you look to the street opposite, all been demolished since, of course. But what this meant was that it was very difficult for anyone to take pot shots at us going in or out of the mill. So it was a very secure entrance. There's a view from across the road back into the mill. Notice the 2 sandbagged sangers there. Better than the 1970 ones, because at this stage the IRA had got hold of rocket-propelled grenades, RPG-7s. This is a view of our yard. On the left you'll see the vehicles lined up. On the right, that is the company gathering because we were expecting a funeral to take place and then possibly rioting afterwards. This view is towards Divis Street, is along Divis Street, towards the Falls Road. You'll see Divis Tower, which dominated the area. On the top of it, on the south side, we had a simple observation post. It had a working lift, and we used to go up there very carefully, but because people were living there, we never had any problems. The other reason we had no problems was because if you're an IRA terrorist, if you're in that building, it's easy to seal you off. You can't get away unless you want to jump out of a window from the 14th floor. So we didn't have any terrorist threat on that. Certainly not by the time we were there. But I draw your attention to the black cabs. These are traditional London black cabs. You might say, what are they doing here in Belfast? Well, they came from Coventry and other cities in England. They were not roadworthy, they weren't taxed, they weren't licensed, they were operated by the IRA. Why? Notice the corporation bus. What they used to do is further down the falls, they used to hijack buses for no reason at all. They'd just have a guy with a hood on, with a pistol, stop the bus. The driver would get out, he knew the routine. Yes, I'll walk away. They would then set it on fire, the passengers would all get out. Belfast Corporation would then stop running the bus service. How are people going to get back from the city centre back to West Belfast? Black taxis. It's a money-making racket. Just as the number of pubs and clubs and bars that were bombed was also to restrict alcohol access. So we, the IRA, will run a drinking club in the Lower Falls, and we set up a drinking club, illegal of course, inside Divis Flats. The Irish call it a shebeen. So when I was bored and we were on standby and nothing was happening, I would go and set up a vehicle checkpoint and stop black taxis and say, "Good morning, sir. Are you licensed? Can I see your license from Belfast City Council? Can I see your MOT certificate?" Because the police were no longer policing. They'd look at me in astonishment. What on earth is this idiot talking about? "Well, you can't show me anything. Right. Everybody out, please. Sorry. You can't travel in this car. It's not safe." I did it really to annoy people. Sorry, that's a bit childish of me, but my feeling is if you're being illegal, then sorry, you shouldn't be being illegal. This shows a Saracen. We used to patrol with Saracens, either in a Saracen, which is pointless because, as the Russians are finding in Ukraine, you can't see very much if you're inside one of those. So we would have that supporting our foot patrol. What you see on the right-hand side is a person check. Corporal Hansen, one of my section commanders, is getting details of somebody. And notice it's being done politely. There's no aggro there. And I had to keep impressing on my soldiers that the politer you are to the ungodly, the more they hate it. If you're rude and bash them, that's what they expect. This is a foot patrol in a nice area. This isn't the Lower Falls. This is close by the city centre. Our boundary went round quite an area. This gives you a very good idea of the problem of running around the streets of the Lower Falls. Where can you take cover? As an infantryman, you can't take cover. You're exposed on the street. This is Quadrant Street and another street in the Falls. Again, notice the mixture of housing and notice the mixture of derelicts. So you've got derelict properties with people living in some of the houses. They're the old Victorian housing, presumably for the mill workers who used to work at Albert Street Mill. But again, there's nowhere as an infantryman to go. But there's an awful lot of places for people to take cover and to snipe at you. In the 8 months from April 1972 to October 1972, we had 8 members of my regiment shot dead by single-shot snipers. Headshots and heart shots. Predominantly out of proportion were section commanders, corporals, that's the patrol leader of a foot patrol, and 1 second lieutenant. The 3rd battalion, who we took over from, had 4 casualties, deaths. We had 4 deaths. So in a matter of 6 months, we had more deaths than the regiment had in Afghanistan. Interesting. That's a IRA funeral. And that's the riot that followed it. Notice this guy. He's at the back organising the riot. Let me get to this. How am I doing for time? Yes, we'll come to an end shortly. Here we've got an extension of the Divis flats that were still being built. This shot is from a window and the balcony. This is funny. When we first arrived, the locals didn't realise that we were a new regiment because we were taking over from our 3rd Battalion. So all our soldiers had the same cap badge. They didn't realise we were new. So the IRA hadn't managed to stage a welcome. They did stage a welcome eventually when they twigged that we were the new boys in town. So they were there in this area. I had 2 sections in the flats, roughly where we are now. They had a Thompson, an Armalite, a couple of rifles, possibly a Kalashnikov. We think it was a Kalashnikov. Anyway, we had 4 or 5 gunmen shooting at Albert Street Mill. And I had 2 sections lying on the balcony, returning fire, and this is during the night, saying, look for the flash and fire at the flash. Well, one of the problems in built-up areas is where's this coming from? You've got to look for the flash, but as soon as the flash is ended, you're shooting at a building. So for 3/4 of an hour, they were shooting at the mill, we were shooting at them, and nothing. So we all went home. It was almost surrealistic, but what happened here was not so much fun. Let me bring you to the 29th of September. Down at the end of Albert Street here was a butcher's shop. Somebody walked into that butcher's shop on the morning of, I think it was Saturday the 29th, and placed a parcel bomb and said, you've got a couple of minutes to get out. So they did, they got out, and boom, up it went. My company commander wanted to go down to see what had happened. And he'd have to go along this road, Albert Street. So he told me to put a section of because I was on standby, to put a section in the flats here, where we're standing from. Corporal Sanderson, the section commander, saw movement in one of those windows. And I was sitting in the ops room, ready with a section already sitting in a vehicle downstairs. My platoon sergeant and the other 2 sections were on standby, but at a 20 minutes notice. So I sent the first section forward and said, come with me guys, let's get in the vehicle. We took a Saracen down there and I parked it there. Got out, got the boys to get out, take cover, and in my ear I'm hearing, oh, there's somebody in the window and we can see a rifle. They're trying to point it down. I didn't want to look up. So I went in through the chemist shop that was open and said, can I get upstairs? No, it's all sealed. What about the door at the side? Oh, I'll try that. Kicked it. It was their store. Went nowhere. So I went into Servier Street there, into number 2, kicked their front door down, went through with the section, over the wall and into the back of that building. There was a guy by the outside window who went like this. He was the spotter, as we discovered afterwards. So I gave him to the section commander and said, hang on to him. A mob later managed to rescue him, but that's another story. I then climbed into the back of the derelict and heard scrabbling above me. And a gunman came out of that window there, on the roof, and Corporal Sanderson gave a fire control order and shot him dead. I stuck like an Apache, I sort of put my berry on the end of my rifle and stuck it up through the window and said, the next person coming out of this window is me. So go round and tell all your guys, weapons tight. In other words, no firing, please. And we found a dead body on the roof, blood flowing down the tiles. I took a clip of ammunition from his hand and the rifle, a Garand rifle, from his hand. We had to get the body back in through there, and to be honest, at this stage I was feeling elated. This is the first time in our whole tour that anyone in the battalion had had an incident like this, and it was a classic little infantry platoon type job, and I was feeling good. That was the problem. Fed the body in into the building, managed to get it down, but we couldn't get him out, so we had to call the other sections with my platoon sergeant to come down, also a Saracen ambulance and medics, because although he was very much dead, it's not my job to say he's dead, it has to be a medic or a doctor or whatever. So we wanted to get him to the Royal Victoria Hospital. While I was doing this, of course, I wasn't thinking about other dangers. It was then that Private Ian Stuart Burt was head sniped and killed outright at the back of that building. And at the end of the day, I wondered, what have we actually achieved here? What have we achieved? There's the gunman, James Quigley, 18 years of age, had been arrested 2 weeks earlier. Notice the date. You might just see it at the bottom there. I think it's the 17th of September, 72. We think it may have been his brother, but obviously they had gunmen in various locations in the lower falls. That was the weapon that he had. The IRA admitted he was a gunman and he was a volunteer. Yes, so 2 young men dead. What's been achieved on the 29th? I felt at the time guilty. I felt that we had achieved very little. Just 2 young men dead. Let me mention this lady before I finish and wrap up. That's Eileen McConville. She was one of the missing. When we first went into Divis flats, we had to maintain a permanent presence there. So 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for our whole time we were there, we always had at least one section of soldiers in Divis. As a result, we never had any problems in Divis. Other regiments did later. But she disappeared in December. She lived on Farset Row, which was the top of one of the blocks. And I remember her showing me in late July, early August, bullet holes in her rooms, in her flat, fired by the B Specials when they were trying to do riot control. They were just firing out of control. But anyway, she spoke to us soldiers. We would say hello, we'd pop in, have a chat. Not in intelligence purposes, but the locals were convinced that she was an informant to the army. So in December, when she had moved her flat down to a ground floor flat, she was visited by about 12 people and taken away. Her body wasn't found until 2003 on a beach in the Republic of Ireland. She was registered as one of the missing. So they had put a bullet through the back of her head after torturing her. A mother of 10 children. Her crime was she talked to British soldiers, not an informant. Her crime was that she had been married to a British soldier who had died earlier of natural causes. This man you might recognise. He, Jerry Adams, was in Divis. I met him one night in the illegal drinking club, couldn't arrest him because the official IRA had an official ceasefire and were actually talking at that stage with the British government. I didn't know about that, but I was told not to arrest him. He was fingered by the provisional IRA battalion commander in the Lower Falls as being responsible for her death. He gave the instructions for her to be taken away and dealt with. Could we pin him down? No, but at least he was arrested for 5 days. So although he's meant to be a political wing of the IRA in Sinn Féin, I still to this day believe he was up to his neck in all of it. However, I'm going to finish now with just 2 pictures. I think 3 pictures. We talked earlier about the army and the government with internment, with the Ballymurphy massacre, Bloody Sunday, being a recruiting sergeant for the IRA. The IRA had become a very effective terrorist organization. When you think about it, they fired an RPG-7 at one of our Saracens. They killed 4 of our soldiers. They wounded 23 soldiers altogether in the battalion. They were very effective. This guy is Private Gary Barlow of the Queen's Lancashire Regiment. We handed over to this regiment when we left the Lower Falls that year, in January 73. He was left behind. If you remember, I showed you a picture of Divis Flats. He was left behind by his platoon commander and his section commander when they got back into their Saracen and drove back into Albert Street. A crowd of women gathered round, prevented him going anywhere. Now remember, he's got his rifle, he's got 20 rounds of ammunition. He could have shot his way out if he'd wanted to and ran back to Albert Street, but he didn't. So while they were blocking his way and holding him in, a gunman came with a pistol and shot him dead. His rifle was found a few months later during a search by the army. Why didn't he open fire? Because not all soldiers are bad. He wasn't prepared to open fire on unarmed civilians, even to save his life. These 2 people, Corporals Derek Wood and David Howes, this is the 19th of March 1988. This is a mob who attacked them because they ran into an IRA funeral. They shouldn't have been there. They were being silly, contravening orders. They were signallers who maintained masts. They weren't infantry soldiers. These are personal protection weapons. You see the Browning pistol. That's all they've got. Now, they happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Did they open fire on these people, this mob who attacked them? No, they didn't. They had something like 26 to 30 rounds on them, at least. Because they didn't, they were beaten up. A gunman then came and shot both of them dead. And here is the Catholic priest from the funeral procession giving him the last rites. So soldiers weren't all bad in Northern Ireland. There were some who were just ordinary decent people who paid with their lives by not using the weapons that they were issued with and not being prepared to shoot. In 1972, the IRA killed 170 soldiers. 170 in 1 year. They killed more soldiers in that year than were being killed in Afghanistan. The army only killed over the whole period of the Troubles, 120 Republican terrorists. 120 Republican terrorists. Yet, over 700 soldiers, regular and Ulster Defence Regiment, died. So they were a very effective terror organisation, let alone what they committed at Warren Point in 1989, on the same day that they killed a cousin of the Queen, the Earl Mountbatten. No matter that they managed to bomb Downing Street itself with a mortar, no matter that they razed the shopping centre in Manchester in 1996 and caused £1 billion worth of damage, they bombed Canary Wharf in London. I can go on with the damage and the deaths that this organisation caused. Altogether, there were 3,000 casualties over the 30-year period. I sometimes wonder to this day, when we talk about minimum force, do you mean the minimum force over the maximum time, or do you mean the maximum force for the minimum time? And I am of the school that possibly if those British soldiers first deployed onto the street with their bayonets fixed that I showed you right at the beginning, if those soldiers had started to open fire and then gone back to their barracks, maybe things might have been different. People may have then thought to themselves, maybe we need to calm down and think. Ladies and gentlemen, I've cut things out, and I hope that you found some of that interesting. Thank you very much.